Nobody in that ballroom knew the truth. Not the powdered aristocrats sipping their champagne, not the servants refilling glasses along the walls, and certainly not the Duke himself, laughing louder than anyone at the girl with the country accent. He thought he was mocking a nobody. What he did not know, what no one in that room knew, was that within the month he would be bowing before her. The letter arrived on a gray morning, sealed with wax the color of dried blood. Margaret Whitmore turned it over twice before opening it, her fingers roughened from years of kneading dough and mending fences. She did not recognize the seal. Her aunt, Constance, did. "That's the Ravenscroft crest," Constance said, her voice unusually quiet. "Why would they write to you?" Margaret had no answer. She broke the seal and read the elegant, unfamiliar handwriting twice before the words settled. She was invited, no, summoned to a ball at Ravenscroft Manor. The reason given was thin, almost careless. A distant family connection, a debt of gratitude owed to her late father. Nothing more. It made no sense. The Whitmores had not set foot in noble company in a generation, not since Margaret's grandmother had vanished from that world under circumstances no one in the family spoke of. Margaret had grown up milking cows before sunrise, not curtsying before dukes. And yet the invitation sat there, undeniable, demanding an answer. "You must go," Constance said finally, folding the letter shut as though it might change its mind. "Whatever this is, ignoring a duke's invitation is more dangerous than accepting one." Margaret wanted to laugh. She owned exactly one dress fit for company, faded blue, let out twice at the seams. She had never danced a step of the quadrille in her life. She spoke with the flat, unhurried vowels of the countryside, the kind that made shopkeepers in the nearest town smirk when she asked for flour. But there was something else, something she did not say aloud. Her father, in the last fevered days before he died, had gripped her hand and murmured words she had never fully understood. "They will come for you one day, Maggie. When they do, do not be afraid of what you are." She had assumed it was the fever talking. Now, holding a letter sealed by a duke, she was no longer certain. 3 days later, she stood in the entrance hall of Ravenscroft Manor, her worn blue dress absurdly plain against marble floors that gleamed like still water. Chandeliers dripped golden light over silk gowns and powdered wigs. Every eye that passed over her did so twice, once in curiosity, once in dismissal. She had never felt so exposed in her life. And she had not yet even seen the Duke. The ballroom smelled of beeswax candles and crushed roses, a scent so rich it made Margaret's head swim. She pressed herself against a marble pillar near the edge of the room, hoping the shadows there might swallow her whole. It was a foolish hope. In a dress the color of a robin's egg, faded and let out at every seam, she stood out among the silks and satins like a sparrow dropped into a cage of peacocks. She had been standing there nearly an hour, untouched by a single introduction, when the Duke of Ravenscroft finally crossed her line of sight. She knew him at once, though no one had pointed him out. He carried himself the way men did when they had never once in their lives been told to wait their turn, tall, dark-haired, dressed in black and silver that made every other man in the room look like an afterthought. Nathaniel Ashworth moved through his own ballroom the way a ship moves through water it owns. He might have passed her by entirely, another forgettable guest at the edge of his domain, if his mother had not stopped beside her first. "And who," the Dowager Duchess asked, her painted eyebrows lifting, "do we have here?" "Margaret Whitmore, Your Grace." Margaret dropped into the curtsy she had practiced alone in her bedroom for 3 nights running, praying it would pass for elegant. It did not go unnoticed that her voice, when she spoke, carried the broad, unhurried vowels of the countryside, nothing like the clipped, careful diction of the room around her. A ripple of amusement moved through the small cluster of guests nearby. The Duke, drawn by the sound of it, turned. Whitmore, he repeated, testing the name as though it tasted strange in his mouth. I don't believe I know the family. We keep a farm 2 counties east, Your Grace, Margaret said, lifting her chin. She would not shrink. Whatever else happened tonight, she would not shrink. It was the wrong thing to say, or perhaps exactly the right thing, depending on what one wished to happen next. The Duke's mouth curved, not unkindly at first, and then he repeated her words back to her, mimicking the flat country vowels with theatrical precision. We keep a farm, Your Grace. The laughter that followed came from every direction at once, bright and cutting, the kind of laughter that did not need cruelty behind it to wound just as deeply. A young lord near the punch table laughed so hard he had to set down his glass. Even the Dowager Duchess allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, as though her son had performed a trick for her benefit. Margaret felt the heat rise up her throat and into her cheeks. She had milked cows in the frost before dawn without flinching. She had buried her father with her own hands when no one else would dig fast enough. She had not imagined that a room full of silk and candlelight could hurt worse than either. But something in her, some small, stubborn ember her father had lit long before she understood why, refused to let the humiliation show on her face. She held the Duke's gaze instead of dropping it, and for the briefest moment, something flickered behind his amusement. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first faint suspicion that he had misjudged something he could not yet name. "If you'll excuse me, Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled at her sides. The farm, at least, never mocked a guest for the way she was raised. She turned and walked away before he could answer, before the room's laughter could turn to gasps, before anyone, including herself, could be certain whether she had just ruined the evening or won it. Behind her, the laughter had gone very quiet. Margaret did not remember walking out of the ballroom. One moment she was turning her back on the Duke's mocking laughter, and the next she found herself in a narrow servants' corridor behind the grand staircase, her chest heaving as though she had run a mile rather than crossed a room. She pressed her back against the cool stone wall and closed her eyes. The candlelight and the silk and the cruel, bright laughter all seemed to belong to another world, one she had never asked to enter. She thought of home, the smell of hay and wood smoke, the quiet of the fields at dusk, and for a moment she wanted nothing more than to disappear into it again. It was there, in that dim corridor, that the memory came to her, unbidden and vivid, the way memories of the dying often do. Her father had been sick for nearly a year before the end came. Toward the last weeks, the fever took him in waves, leaving him lucid for an hour and then lost for a day. Margaret had sat beside his bed more nights than she could count, wringing cloths in cold water, listening to him murmur names she did not recognize. But one night, 3 days before he died, he had gripped her wrist with a strength she had not thought his wasted body still possessed, and his eyes had been clear, clearer than they had been in weeks. "Maggie," he had said, using the name only he ever used, "there is something I should have told you long ago. I was a coward not to." She had hushed him, told him to rest, but he shook his head fiercely. "Your grandmother," he had said, "was not who the village believes her to be. She did not simply marry beneath her station and vanish from polite memory out of shame. She was cast out, disowned. Her own father struck her name from the family Bible with his own hand because she chose to marry a farmer instead of the husband arranged for her." Margaret remembered laughing softly at the time, certain the fever was speaking, not her father. Whitmores were not the sort of family with disowned countesses hiding in their past. They were plain people, honest people, people who worked the earth with their hands. But her father had not laughed with her. His grip had only tightened. "Her family was the Earl of Camden's line," he had said. "Your grandmother was his only daughter. When he dies, and he is old now, Maggie, older than I am, there is no other blood left to inherit but her line. Yours." She had thought in the moment that grief was already speaking through him in advance, preparing her for a loss that had not yet come. She had kissed his forehead, told him to sleep, and by morning the clarity had passed and he never spoke of it again. 3 days later he was gone, and she had buried the memory along with him, filing it away as the confused ramblings of a dying man who loved her enough to want her to believe she was something more than a farmer's daughter. Standing now in the shadowed corridor of Ravenscroft Manor, with the Duke's laughter still ringing faintly behind her, the memory did not feel confused at all. She thought of the letter that had summoned her here, sealed with the Ravenscroft crest, citing only a vague debt owed to her late father, offering no true explanation for why a farm girl from 2 counties east had been invited into this world of silk and cruelty. She thought of how the invitation had arrived not from a stranger's whim, but precisely now, precisely when, if her father's words held even a grain of truth, an old earl somewhere might be nearing his final days, with no heir left but a woman who did not yet know she carried his blood. A chill moved through her that had nothing to do with the cold stone at her back. She did not know if it was true. She did not know if a dying man's fevered confession could be trusted, or if it was only the desperate wish of a father who wanted his daughter to believe she was worth more than the world had ever told her she was. But she knew, with sudden and absolute certainty, that she had not been invited to Ravenscroft Manor by accident. Someone in that ballroom knew exactly who she might be, and she intended to find out who before the night was through. Margaret did not return to the ballroom. She told herself it was only to steady her nerves, that she would slip back in through a side door once her hands had stopped trembling, and her face no longer burned with the memory of that laughter. But her feet carried her further from the music with every step, down one corridor and then another, past portraits of Ashworth ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow her with the same cold curiosity as the living guests she had just left behind. She did not know how long she wandered before she found the library. It was not locked. She told herself that was permission enough. The room swallowed the distant sound of the orchestra almost entirely, replacing it with the hush of old paper and leather bindings, thousands of them, rising floor to ceiling on shelves so tall a wheeled ladder stood ready beside them. A fire burned low in the hearth, throwing soft orange light across a great oak desk scattered with correspondence, ledgers, and a decanter of brandy someone had forgotten to finish. Margaret exhaled for what felt like the first time all evening. She wandered along the shelves without truly seeing the titles, her fingers trailing the spines the way she might trail her hand along a fence post at home, simply to feel something solid and familiar beneath her skin. It was here, lost in that small and fragile piece, that she heard the door open behind her. I did not realize anyone else knew this room existed. Margaret spun so quickly she nearly knocked a book from its shelf. The Duke stood in the doorway, his black coat unbuttoned now, his cravat loosened in a way that would have scandalized the ballroom behind him. He looked, for the first time that evening, less like a portrait come to life and more like an ordinary man who had simply wanted quiet. "Your Grace." Margaret dropped into a curtsy out of pure reflex, though every instinct in her screamed to simply walk past him and out the door. "Forgive me. I did not mean to trespass. I only needed." "You needed to escape my ballroom," he said, not unkindly, though there was no apology in it either. "I can hardly blame you. I have needed the same thing myself on more evenings than I would care to admit." Margaret said nothing. She was not certain if this was another trap, another elegant cruelty dressed up as charm. "You left before I could apologize," he said, moving further into the room, close enough now that the firelight caught the sharp lines of his face. "For the laughter, it was unkind. I did not intend." "You intended precisely what happened," Margaret said before she could stop herself. Her father's stubbornness, she thought grimly. It always chose the worst possible moments to surface. You wished to make a spectacle of me for the amusement of your guests, and you succeeded admirably. She expected fury. Dukes were not accustomed to farm girls speaking to them so plainly, and she braced herself for the cold dismissal that would surely follow, perhaps even an order that she be removed from the house entirely. Instead, the Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not name. "You are correct," he said finally. "I did intend it. I have grown so accustomed to this room full of people who agree with everything I say and laugh at everything I find amusing that I forget, sometimes, that cruelty dressed as wit is still cruelty. It is a poor excuse, but it is the truth, and you deserve at least that much." Margaret blinked. Whatever she had expected from the Duke of Ravenscroft, an apology, a real one, unpolished and uncomfortable in his mouth, had not been it. "You needn't trouble yourself, Your Grace," she said carefully. "I am certain I will survive being laughed at by people whose opinions of me matter a great deal less than my opinion of myself." Something shifted in his expression then, not amusement this time, but something closer to genuine interest, as though he were seeing her for the first time not as an oddity to be mocked, but as a person entirely. "That," he said slowly, "is the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in this house in a very long time." He crossed to the desk and poured 2 glasses of brandy without asking whether she wanted one, then held one toward her. Margaret hesitated. Ladies did not drink brandy with dukes in empty libraries, not if they wished to preserve any shred of reputation. But she had already ruined the evening in every way that mattered to people like the Dowager Duchess, and some reckless part of her no longer cared. She took the glass. "Tell me about your farm," he said, settling into the chair behind the desk, "and I promise not to repeat a single word of it back to you in that voice again." For the next quarter of an hour, against every instinct of caution she possessed, Margaret found herself telling him about the frost that came too early most autumns, about the stubborn cow that had kicked over more milk pails than she could count, about her father's laugh, which had been loud and easy despite a hard life that gave him little reason for it. The Duke listened in a way no one in that ballroom had listened to her all evening, without pity, without condescension, simply listened, as though her ordinary life were a country he had never had the chance to visit. It was, she would realize much later, the exact moment everything became more complicated than a single evening of humiliation ever could have been. Because somewhere between the second glass of brandy and the dying light of the fire, Margaret Whitmore looked at Nathaniel Ashworth, Duke of Ravenscroft, and felt something far more dangerous than anger. She felt the beginning of wanting him to see her, not the farm girl the ballroom had mocked, not the possible heiress her father's dying words had hinted at, but simply her, and some quiet, frightened part of her understood that wanting such a thing from a man like him could only end in more heartbreak than pride alone had ever cost her. Bu seifa jursik iki katina sicariorum, san, Jerusalem, is sadishma v dialog katman larini durinlish tirarek. The days that followed the ball should have returned Margaret to the quiet rhythm of the farm, the cold mornings, the milking, the long silences of the fields she had known her whole life. Instead, they brought something far stranger, an invitation to remain at Ravenscroft Manor as a guest of the Dowager Duchess, extended not with warmth but with the cool efficiency of a woman settling a debt she resented owing. Margaret suspected, though no one confirmed it, that the invitation had come at the Duke's quiet insistence. She should have refused. Every practical instinct she possessed told her that a farm girl had no business lingering in a Duke's household, that the longer she stayed, the more dangerous the whispers would grow, and that whatever strange warmth had passed between herself and Nathaniel Ashworth in that firelit library was a luxury she could not afford to indulge. And yet when Constance urged her to accept, citing the mystery of her father's dying words and the possibility of learning more about the Earl of Camden's line, Margaret found she did not need much convincing at all. It was on her 4th day at the manor that she first became aware of Lady Cordelia Ashford. She was a striking woman, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, dressed always in colors so perfectly matched to her complexion that Margaret suspected an entire staff existed for that purpose alone. She had been, Margaret gathered from careful and quiet inquiries among the household staff, all but promised to the Duke since childhood, an arrangement favored deeply by both families, disrupted only by the Duke's own reluctance to formalize it. Lady Cordelia had spent the better part of 2 seasons waiting for that reluctance to fade. She did not take kindly to competition, however unlikely that competition appeared to be. "You must be exhausted," Lady Cordelia said one afternoon, finding Margaret alone in the manor's east garden, where Margaret had taken to walking each day if only to remind herself that fresh air and growing things still existed outside the suffocating elegance of the house. "Pretending to be something you are not requires such constant effort. I find it fascinating that you manage it at all." "I have not pretended to be anything, my lady," Margaret said evenly, refusing to let the barb land visibly. "I have only accepted an invitation I did not seek." How convenient to frame it so innocently. Lady Cordelia's smile did not reach her eyes. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore, do you truly believe the Duke's sudden interest in you is anything more than novelty? Men of his position grow tired of the predictable. A farm girl with a country accent is diverting for precisely as long as it takes for the diversion to grow stale. I have watched it happen before, with women far more polished than you." Margaret felt the words land exactly where they were aimed, in the tender, uncertain place she had been carefully avoiding since that night in the library. She had told herself, repeatedly, that whatever she had felt beside that fire meant nothing, that it could not mean anything, that a duke did not fall for farm girls in stories that ended well for the farm girl. "I have made no claims on the Duke's affections," Margaret said carefully. "I would thank you not to invent them on my behalf." "I do hope that is true," Lady Cordelia said, "for both our sakes. Because I intend to marry Nathaniel Ashworth by the end of this season, Miss Whitmore, and I do not take kindly to obstacles, however temporary, however beneath my notice they might otherwise be." She left before Margaret could form a response, her skirts moving with the same practiced precision as everything else about her. Margaret told herself the encounter meant nothing. She was wrong. Within 2 days, the whispers began, quiet at first, then louder, spreading through the household with the particular efficiency reserved for scandal among people with too much leisure and too little occupation for their minds. She heard fragments of it in passing. A farm girl had been seen leaving the Duke's private study late at night. A farm girl had been overheard boasting of a secret understanding with the Duke himself. A farm girl, some said, had come to Ravenscroft Manor specifically to entrap a wealthy man into marriage, having heard rumors of his fortune from some distant, opportunistic relation. None of it was true, all of it spread as though it were gospel. Margaret bore it as long as she could, holding her chin high through dinners where conversation stopped the moment she entered a room, through walks in the garden where servants exchanged knowing glances behind gloved hands. But the true blow came on the 6th day, when she was summoned, not invited, summoned to the Dowager Duchess's private sitting room. The Duchess did not offer her a seat. "I have tolerated your presence in this house as a courtesy to my son," the Duchess said, her voice cold and precise as cut glass, "though I confess I have never fully understood the debt he believes he owes your late father. But I will not tolerate a scandal built upon your name attaching itself to this family. Do you understand me, Miss Whitmore?" "I have done nothing to invite such rumors, Your Grace," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady though her hands trembled at her sides. I would ask that you consider the source of them before assuming their truth." "I consider the source quite carefully," the Duchess replied. "A young woman of no fortune and no name arrives suddenly in my household, and within a fortnight, whispers circulate that she seeks to entrap my son into marriage. Forgive me if I find the timing suspicious rather than coincidental." Margaret opened her mouth to defend herself, but the Duchess raised a single gloved hand, silencing her. "I have written to your aunt," the Duchess continued. "You will return home within the week. Whatever business my son believes remains unfinished between your family, and this one can be concluded through correspondence, as it should have been from the beginning." It was, Margaret understood with sudden, sinking clarity, precisely what Lady Cordelia had intended all along, not merely to wound her with words in a quiet garden, but to ensure she was removed from the house entirely before whatever fragile thing had begun between herself and the Duke could be given the chance to grow into something neither Cordelia nor the Duchess could control. That evening, Margaret packed the single trunk she had arrived with, her hands moving through the familiar motions of folding and closing with a numbness that felt almost merciful. She did not cry. She had promised herself, kneeling beside her father's grave many months before, that she would not allow this world, a world that had never wanted her, that had laughed at her voice and doubted her worth from the moment she crossed its threshold, the satisfaction of her tears. But as she closed the trunk and looked once more around the guest room that had, however briefly, felt like the beginning of something extraordinary, she allowed herself one quiet, aching thought. She had come to Ravenscroft Manor believing herself, at best, a farmer's daughter caught in a stranger's careless summons. She was leaving it uncertain whether she was the granddaughter of an earl, the target of a jealous woman's cruelty, or simply a fool who had allowed herself to hope for something that people like her were never permitted to have. Whatever the truth, one thing had become painfully clear in the space of a single week. The world of dukes and duchesses did not simply mock girls like Margaret Whitmore. It destroyed them, quietly and efficiently, whenever they dared to want something it had not offered freely. Margaret's trunk sat packed and waiting by the door of her guest room when the second letter arrived. It came not by the manor's usual post, carried by a footman on a silver tray, but by a stranger, a thin, travel-worn man in a plain gray coat who insisted, with unusual firmness for a servant, that the letter be placed directly into Margaret's own hands and no one else's. Constance, who had arrived at Ravenscroft Manor only that morning to accompany her niece home in disgrace, watched the exchange with visible suspicion. "Who sent you?" Margaret asked, turning the letter over in her hands. The seal was unfamiliar, plain wax without a crest, nothing like the elaborate correspondence that passed through this house daily. "My master is a solicitor, miss. Mr. Aldous Finch of Finch and Barrow, London." The man glanced over his shoulder as though he feared being overheard, though the corridor was empty. "He has been searching for you these past 6 weeks, ever since instructions reached him from the Earl of Camden's estate. I was told to find a Miss Margaret Whitmore, daughter of the late Thomas Whitmore, and to place this into no hands but her own." Margaret's fingers stilled on the seal. "The Earl of Camden is dead, then," she said quietly, though it was not truly a question. Something in her chest had already known the answer before the stranger nodded. 3 weeks passed, miss. Peacefully in his sleep at his estate in Camden Hall. There is no direct heir remaining, no son, no grandson, and his only daughter has been presumed dead or estranged for some 40 years, her whereabouts unknown since her disownment. My master has spent considerable effort tracing what became of her line, should it exist at all. Constance had gone very pale beside her. Margaret broke the seal with trembling hands and read. The letter was formal, dense with legal language she had to read twice to fully absorb, but its meaning, once understood, struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her grandmother, the woman the village had always spoken of only in careful whispers, the woman her father had claimed in his final delirious days, was a disowned countess, had indeed been Lady Eleanora Camden, only daughter of the 7th Earl of Camden. Her marriage to a farmer named Josiah Whitmore had resulted in her complete disinheritance, her name struck from the family record, her existence erased from Camden society entirely. But blood, the solicitor's letter made clear in its careful, precise phrasing, could not be so easily erased from the law of inheritance. With no other legitimate heir remaining, the Camden earldom and its considerable estate would pass, by the strict rules of entail, to the next surviving descendant of Lady Eleanora's line. That descendant was Margaret. "You are certain," Constance whispered, reading the letter over Margaret's shoulder for the 3rd time, as though repetition might change its contents, "that this is not some cruel trick?" "My master would not risk his reputation on a falsehood of this magnitude," the solicitor's man said stiffly. "The proof exists in the parish records of Camden Hall itself, in the Earl's own correspondence, in documents my master has spent 6 weeks verifying beyond doubt. Miss Whitmore is, as of 3 weeks ago, the rightful Countess of Camden." Margaret sat down heavily on the edge of her packed trunk, the letter trembling in her hands. Her father's dying words came back to her with sudden, overwhelming clarity. "They will come for you one day, Maggie asterisk," and she understood, finally and completely, that he had not been speaking in the confusion of fever after all. He had known. Perhaps not the full truth, perhaps not the timing, but he had known enough to try to prepare her, and she had dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying man too weak to separate memory from delirium. She should have felt triumphant. She should have felt, at the very least, vindicated. Every sneer, every mocking laugh, every whispered insult about her country accent and her worn blue dress suddenly rendered absurd by the truth this letter revealed. Instead, sitting on a trunk packed for her humiliating departure from Ravenscroft Manor, she felt only a hollow, aching sense of timing so cruel it bordered on unbearable. Because it was at that precise moment, letter still trembling in her hands, that the door opened without warning, and the Duke of Ravenscroft entered the room. He had come, she would later learn, to say goodbye before her departure, a gesture of decency his mother had neither requested nor approved of. He stopped short at the sight of the stranger in the plain gray coat, at Constance's stricken face, at Margaret's own expression, caught somewhere between shock and grief, and something she could not yet name. "What has happened?" the Duke asked, his eyes moving between them with growing alarm. "Margaret." He stopped himself, visibly, at the familiarity of using her given name without permission, but Margaret was too overwhelmed to correct him. "Nothing that concerns you, Your Grace," Constance said quickly, stepping forward with the letter clutched protectively to her chest before Margaret could speak a word. "A private family matter, nothing more." But it was too late. The solicitor's man, unaware of the delicate politics unfolding around him, had already spoken his errand aloud once, and something in his bearing, the formality of his address, the mention of an earldom, had clearly reached the Duke's ears before Constance could silence the room. "An earldom," the Duke repeated slowly, his gaze fixing on Margaret with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "What is this about an earldom, Margaret?" She should have told him the truth. Later, she would wonder endlessly whether everything that followed might have unfolded differently if she had simply spoken plainly in that moment, if she had explained the letter, the solicitor, her grandmother's disownment, her father's dying confession. But shock had stolen her voice entirely, and in the terrible silence that followed his question, the Duke's expression began, slowly and unmistakably, to change. "You said nothing of this before," he said quietly. "Not once in all the hours we spoke in the library, not a single word." "I did not know," Margaret managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nathaniel, I swear to you, I did not know until this very moment." "And yet you accepted my mother's invitation to remain here," he continued, his voice growing colder with every word. "Knowing your family carried some claim to nobility, knowing this correspondence was likely already underway, and you said nothing. Was I a fool to believe our conversations meant something honest between us, or was I simply another useful connection to cultivate in case your fortunes changed?" "That is not fair," Margaret said, rising to her feet despite the way her legs trembled beneath her. "I have told you nothing but the truth since the moment we met. I did not seek this inheritance. I did not know it existed until the very letter you now hold me accountable for." But the Duke, wounded by his own recent history with women who had wanted his title more than his company, and stung by Lady Cordelia's careful whispers of the past week suggesting Margaret's motives were never as innocent as they appeared, could not, in that moment, hear the truth in her voice over the suspicion already curdling in his chest. "Perhaps it would be best," he said, his voice now flat and formal, the warmth of the library entirely extinguished, "if you continued your journey home as planned, Miss Whitmore. Whatever your circumstances, whatever your family's history, it seems there is a great deal about you I do not know, and a great deal you chose not to share with me." He left without waiting for her response, the door closing behind him with a quiet, final click that echoed through Margaret far louder than any shout could have. Constance moved to comfort her, but Margaret stood frozen, staring at the door through which the one person who had ever truly listened to her had just walked away, believing the worst of her at the precise moment she had finally learned the truth of who she was. She had spent her entire life being underestimated, dismissed, laughed at for the plainness of her birth. She had never once imagined that the moment fortune finally turned in her favor would feel exactly like losing everything that had mattered most. The journey back to the farm took 2 days, and Margaret spent every hour of it in silence so complete that even Constance, who rarely lacked for words, did not attempt to fill it. She stared out the carriage window at the passing countryside, fields going gold with early autumn, hedgerows thick with blackberries, the same landscape she had known her entire life, and felt none of the comfort she had expected to find in returning home. The farm had always been her anchor, the one place in the world where she knew exactly who she was and exactly what was expected of her. Now she was returning to it as something else entirely, a countess who did not yet know how to be won, carrying the weight of a title she had never asked for and a heartbreak she had never anticipated. She told herself repeatedly that the Duke's opinion of her did not matter. She had survived humiliation before. She would survive this too. She did not believe herself, not for a single mile of that long, silent journey. At Ravenscroft Manor, the days following Margaret's departure passed in a manner Nathaniel Ashworth would later describe, to no one but himself, as the most miserable fortnight of his adult life. He told himself, as he had told Margaret, that her silence regarding the earldom was a betrayal, proof that whatever warmth had passed between them in the library had been calculated rather than genuine. One more version of the same ambition he had spent years learning to recognize and avoid in the women who orbited his title. He repeated this explanation to himself so often, in fact, that he very nearly believed it. But belief, he was discovering, was a fragile thing when set against the memory of Margaret's face in that guest room. Not the face of a woman caught in a scheme, but the face of someone genuinely, devastatingly blindsided by news she had not sought and could not yet comprehend. He remembered, too, every unguarded moment of their conversation in the library, the easy honesty with which she had spoken of her father, her farm, her ordinary life, none of it bearing the practiced polish of someone angling for advantage. Ambitious women, in his experience, did not speak so plainly of milking cows and stubborn livestock. They spoke of connections, of introductions, of futures they wished to secure. Margaret had spoken of none of these things. The doubt gnawed at him slowly, over days rather than hours, the way true regret often does, not in a single dramatic moment of clarity, but in small, accumulating fragments. A comment overheard from a servant, praising Margaret's kindness toward the household staff during her brief stay, staff she had no reason to court favor with, since none of them held any influence over her future. A conversation with his own mother, who admitted, with obvious reluctance, that she had perhaps acted with more haste than fairness in demanding Margaret's departure, influenced more heavily by Lady Cordelia's persistent whispers than she cared to acknowledge. And then, finally, a visit from Mr. Aldous Finch himself, the solicitor whose letter had appended everything, arriving at Ravenscroft Manor to conduct further inquiries regarding the Camden inheritance and mentioning, almost in passing, the precise timeline of his investigation. 6 weeks, Your Grace, Finch said, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed his own notes. I began my search for Lady Eleanora's descendants 6 weeks past, immediately following the Earl's declining health, though I did not locate Miss Whitmore, the Countess, I should say now, until this very week. She could not possibly have known of her circumstances before my letter reached her. I made every effort to ensure she was the very first to learn of it, precisely to prevent any opportunist from reaching her first with false promises or manipulation. Nathaniel sat with this information for a long moment, turning it over with the same careful scrutiny he might apply to a contract or a ledger, searching for some flaw in its logic that would allow him to preserve the comfortable anger he had been nursing for a fortnight. He found none. The timeline was unimpeachable. Margaret could not have known. She had told him the truth in that guest room, and he had chosen, in his wounded pride, not to believe her. The realization did not arrive gently. It struck him with the force of genuine shame, the kind that settles deep in the chest and refuses to be reasoned away. He had spent years guarding himself against women who wanted his title more than his company, and in doing so, he had failed to recognize the one woman who had wanted neither, who had, in fact, seemed entirely unmoved by his title from the very first moment they met, mocking though that meeting had been. She had challenged him in that library with more honesty than anyone in his own household had offered him in years, and he had repaid that honesty by assuming the worst of her. The instant circumstances grew complicated. I must go to her, he said aloud, more to himself than to the solicitor seated across from him. Your Grace, Margaret, the Countess of Camden, I have wronged her, and I intend to correct it if she will permit me the chance. Finch, to his credit, did not comment on the abrupt shift in his employer's demeanor, though a faint knowing smile touched the corner of his mouth as he gathered his papers. The ride to the Whitmore farm took the better part of a day, longer than Nathaniel had anticipated, made longer still by his own growing anxiety with every mile that passed. He rehearsed what he might say a dozen different ways, none of them adequate to the depth of the apology he owed her, and by the time the farmhouse came into view, modest, weathered, entirely unremarkable in every way except that it was hers, he found he had no rehearsed words left at all. Margaret was in the yard when he arrived, sleeves rolled to her elbows, in the middle of mending a fence post with the same quiet competence she brought to everything she did. She looked up at the sound of an unfamiliar carriage, and Nathaniel watched her expression shift through surprise, then wariness, then something colder and more guarded than either. Your Grace, she said, setting down her tools with deliberate slowness, I confess I did not expect to see you again, given the manner of our last conversation. I have come to apologize, Nathaniel said, dismounting before his courage could fail him entirely. I was wrong, Margaret. I allowed my own past disappointments and my mother's suspicions and Lady Cordelia's poison to convince me of something I should have known was false the moment I saw your face in that room. You did not know of the inheritance. You could not have known. I have since confirmed the timeline with Mr. Finch himself, and I am ashamed that I required outside confirmation of a truth you offered me freely, simply because my pride could not bear to trust it in the moment it mattered most. Margaret said nothing for a long moment, studying him with an expression he could not fully read, not quite forgiveness, but not quite the cold dismissal he had feared either. "You wounded me deeply, Nathaniel," she said finally, using his given name for the first time since their falling out, which he chose to take as a small, fragile sign of hope. "Not because I expected better from a duke. I have long understood how little the world of dukes and duchesses expects from women like me. But because I believed, for one evening beside your fire, that you saw me plainly, without title or fortune clouding your judgment. Discovering that trust could be so easily shattered by suspicion was harder to bear than any laughter your ballroom offered me." "I know," Nathaniel said quietly. "I have no excuse worthy of the pain I caused you. I can only tell you that I have spent every day since your departure recognizing, with increasing clarity, precisely how wrong I was, and precisely how much I wish to earn back whatever trust I so carelessly discarded." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Nathaniel began to fear he had arrived too late, that whatever fragile thing had grown between them in that library had been too thoroughly extinguished by his own doubt to be rekindled. But Margaret, watching him with the same steady, unflinching gaze she had once turned on an entire ballroom full of mocking aristocrats, finally allowed herself the smallest, most cautious of smiles. "You have a great deal of proving left to do, Your Grace," she said, "before I offer my trust so easily a second time." "Then I intend to spend as long as it takes proving it," Nathaniel replied, and meant every word. Word travels strangely in noble circles, slower than truth deserves, faster than dignity can withstand. By the time Margaret Whitmore's inheritance became common knowledge among the families who had once laughed at her country accent, the story had already grown several layers removed from fact, embellished by each retelling until she was, depending on which drawing room one visited, either a long-lost princess in disguise or a scheming fortune hunter who had somehow manufactured an earldom out of nothing but ambition and luck. Margaret cared little for either version. She had spent a lifetime being defined by other people's assumptions, and she was not inclined to spend her newfound title the same way. But Nathaniel, having spent the past several weeks proving, through patient visits, honest letters, and a persistence Margaret had not expected from a man of his pride, that his regret was genuine and his affection had survived the ordeal intact, understood something Margaret herself had not yet fully considered. The whispers would not simply fade on their own. If the truth of her character was ever to be understood by the same society that had first mocked her, it would need to be witnessed, not merely rumored. "There will be another ball," he told her one afternoon, as they walked together along the low stone wall separating her farm's eastern pasture from the woods beyond, a walk that had become a quiet ritual between them in recent weeks. "My mother has already begun the arrangements, largely as a means of repairing whatever damage her own hasty judgment caused. I would like you to attend." Not as Margaret Whitmore, farm girl of curious origins, but as the Countess of Camden, in full view of everyone who once thought so little of you. Margaret considered this for a long moment, watching a hawk circle lazily over the tree line. "You wish to parade me before them, then, to prove a point?" "I wish," Nathaniel said carefully, "to give you the choice I denied you the first time, to enter that room as precisely who you are, without apology, and to let anyone who dares laugh discover exactly what they are laughing at." She agreed, though not without private reservations that lingered until the very evening of the ball itself. The gown she wore this time was not the faded blue dress let out twice at the seams. It was deep emerald silk, tailored by the same modiste who dressed the Dowager Duchess herself, a gift Margaret had initially resisted and finally accepted only when Constance pointed out, with characteristic bluntness, that refusing fine things out of misplaced humility was its own kind of vanity. When Margaret descended the grand staircase of Ravenscroft Manor for the second time in as many months, the ballroom fell into a silence far more profound than the laughter that had greeted her the first time. She recognized faces from that earlier humiliation scattered throughout the crowd, the young lord who had laughed so hard he'd spilled his punch, several ladies who had exchanged knowing smirks behind their fans at the sound of her accent. Their expressions now carried none of that earlier cruelty. Shock, certainly. A measure of shame, in some cases. And beneath it all, the particular deference that wealth and title commanded regardless of whether it had been earned through birth or discovered through unexpected inheritance. Lady Cordelia Ashford stood near the refreshment table, her face carefully composed, though Margaret did not miss the tightness around her eyes as Nathaniel crossed the room without hesitation, bypassing every other guest, to stand beside Margaret at the base of the staircase. "Lady Camden," he said, loudly enough for the nearest guests to hear, offering his arm with the same formal gravity he might extend to any woman of unquestionable rank. "Might I have the honor of this dance?" "You may, Your Grace," Margaret replied, allowing herself, at last, a small private smile as she took his arm. "Though I should warn you, I have had considerably less practice at the quadrille than the ladies who usually grace your ballroom floor." "Then we shall be equally clumsy together," Nathaniel said, "and I find I would not have it any other way." They danced, and the orchestra played, and the ballroom that had once erupted in cruel laughter at the sound of her voice now watched in something closer to fascination, as the Duke of Ravenscroft looked at the Countess of Camden, as though no one else in the room existed at all. It was the Dowager Duchess, of all people, who approached Margaret later that evening, once the dancing had given way to quieter conversation among the assembled guests. She found Margaret near the same marble pillar where Margaret had once tried to disappear into the shadows, though this time Margaret stood in full view, unafraid. "I owe you an apology, Lady Camden," the Duchess said, her voice stiff with the particular discomfort of a proud woman unaccustomed to admitting fault. "I judged you unfairly. Influenced by whispers, I should have questioned more carefully before acting upon them. It was beneath the dignity I claim to value so highly." "Apology accepted, Your Grace," Margaret said simply. "Though I confess I have found in recent weeks that the good opinion of those who judge too quickly matters rather less to me than it once did." The Duchess studied her for a long moment, and something like respect flickered behind her composed expression. "Perhaps that is precisely why my son has grown so attached to you, Lady Camden. You are entirely unmoved by the things that move everyone else in this room." Lady Cordelia offered no such reconciliation. She left the ball early that evening, her engagement to a minor viscount announced within the month, a match everyone understood to be considerably beneath what she had once hoped to secure for herself. As for Margaret, the weeks that followed the ball brought their own quiet transformation. She traveled to Camden Hall to formally claim her inheritance, walking the halls her grandmother had once been forced to abandon, standing before the very portrait of Lady Eleanora Camden that had been hidden away in a forgotten storage room for 40 years, its subject's face bearing an uncanny resemblance to Margaret's own. She restored the painting to its rightful place in the family gallery, a quiet act of justice her father had never lived to see fulfilled. She did not abandon the farm. She could not have, even if she wished to. It was too deeply woven into who she was, the frost-covered mornings and stubborn livestock and hard, honest work that had shaped her long before any earldom had claimed her. Instead, she divided her time between both worlds, bringing something of the farm's plain honesty into the halls of Camden Estate, and something of her newfound position back to the people who had known her only as Thomas Whitmore's daughter. Nathaniel proposed to her 6 months after that second ball, not in a grand ballroom before an audience of curious aristocrats, but in the same eastern pasture where they had first walked together as equals, far from any title or expectation. "I loved you before I knew you were a countess," he told her, kneeling in the frost-covered grass with a ring that had belonged to his own grandmother. "And I would love you still if the letter from Mr. Finch had never arrived at all. I want you to know that before you answer, because I never wish for you to doubt it again." "I know," Margaret said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it completely. "I have known it for some time now. I was only waiting for you to be certain of it yourself." She said yes. 3 years later, the halls of Camden Hall echoed with a very different sound than the cold formality that had once defined them. The laughter of children, the clatter of muddy boots by the back door, the particular chaos of a household that had learned to blend noble tradition with the unpretentious warmth Margaret had carried with her from the farm. She still visited the old farmhouse every autumn, walking the same fields where she had once buried her father, telling him quietly, each year, how much had changed since the fevered night he had gripped her hand and whispered a truth she had not been ready to believe. Nathaniel often accompanied her on these visits, no longer the proud duke who had once mocked a stranger's accent for the amusement of a ballroom, but a man who had learned, through his own humbling, that the truest measure of a person had nothing to do with the way they spoke or the wealth of their birth. On quiet evenings, when their children begged for stories before bed, Margaret would sometimes tell them of the night their father laughed at a farm girl's country accent in front of an entire ballroom, unaware that the girl he mocked would one day become his wife, his countess, and the truest partner he had ever known. "Did you hate him then, Mama?" her eldest daughter asked once, wide-eyed by candlelight. "For a moment," Margaret admitted, smiling at the memory that no longer carried any sting at all. "But your father learned in time that the people we too quickly judge are often the very ones who end up teaching us the most. He had no idea who I really was that night. It took him a great deal of courage to find out, and considerably more courage to admit how wrong he had been." Outside, the same fields that had once felt impossibly distant from the world of dukes and duchesses stretched golden under the setting sun, belonging now, as they always had, to a woman who had never needed a title to know her own worth, only the chance, finally, to be seen for it. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.